Today we're going to be talking about chord scales. Now, in a previous video that was entitled 18 Questions to Improv, I went over chord scales in the 18 Answers video. So if you want a brief overview about chord scales, you can go to the 18 Answers video, and there's an overview of chord scales in that video. But today we're going to go over it in further detail, because I wanted to make a video on how to approach the chords of a blues progression, but it takes a little bit of knowledge in chord scales to know how to do that. So before I make that video, we're going to talk about the construction of a chord scale. I'm going to go over it on the board here, and then I'm going to play it on the piano and on the guitar so you get a good visualization of it. So a chord scale is basically just a scale that is harmonized with itself. So as we do normally, we'll start with a C major scale, write that out, and go over the construction of a chord scale. So again, all the chord scale really is harmonizing the scale with itself. So if I played the C major scale, I usually play this in single notes. But now if we're going to do a chord scale, we're going to make chords out of all these. So if we're going to make triads out of these, then we know that a triad is made out of a 1, 3, and 5. But I'm going to pick out the 1, 3, and 5 from the C, and that gives me C major. Now, if I do that again here, on the next note, that gives me D minor. And this is why it's important. And I'll do one more just so we can see that there's a pattern going on here. So the third note would be an E. Now if I do the same thing and come down with this E, and make a triad out of it, then I have E, G, B. That gives me an E minor. Now, as you can see from just doing those 3 chords, that just by virtue of going through the scale and making arpeggios out of them, or making triads out of them, we get a specific chord quality at each scale tone. And that's really the importance of a chord scale. So if we number all of the notes of a chord scale, then we have, just like we do with progressions, we just number 1 through 8. I just leave that blank, it's an octave. So we have the 1 chord, 2 chord, 3 chord, 4 chord, 5 chord, 6 chord, and 7 chord. What happens is, just by virtue of going through the scale and playing triads out of each note, you end up with a certain chord quality. And that's the importance of learning the chord scales. So what happens is that just by virtue of playing and making triads out of these notes, then we end up with certain chord qualities, and this doesn't change. This is just always how the pattern comes out to be. So the first chord will be a major chord. The second will be a minor. The third will be a minor. The fourth will be a major. The fifth will be a major, but also a dominant. So I'll just put a 7 in there. That'll also be a dominant. We'll talk about that more in a second, because that's really important. And then the sixth, some that might have some music theory might be familiar with the sixth, because the sixth is also the relative minor. So that's often how you find your relative minor. If you want to know what the relative minor of a chord or a scale is, then you go to the sixth, and that'll give you the relative minor. So the relative minor of C major is A minor. So the sixth would be a minor, and the seven would be a diminished. Now, for all the jazz folks out there, sometimes, actually more often than not, the 7 is sometimes or oftentimes referred to as the minor 7, flat 5. Okay? So this is a chord scale sequence. So what you want to repeat to yourself and kind of get in your head is that if they ask you, what is a chord scale? Well, you would say a major chord scale is major, minor, minor, major, dominant, minor, diminished. Now, again, what we see here is that we have 3 major chords. Remember, the 5 does double as a dominant. Again, we'll talk about that later. But what we have is we have 3 major chords. So a major scale, we can say that a major scale equals 3 major chords, 3 minor chords, and has a dominant and one dominant and one diminished. So this is really important to take note of when we're trying to do any kind of chord analysis. If you're trying to figure out the chords of a song or the modulations, a good trick is to look at the 5, because there's only one of them in each scale. You could also look at the diminished, but the diminished is rarely going to be used. There are more diminished chords used in jazz, obviously, even in classical music, but by and large, in any form of music, you're going to find more 5s than you are going to find a 7. So if you're looking for the key center, then you look for the 5, because there's only one of them. If you were looking for C, since there's 3 major chords in each major scale, that means that the chord C major appears in 3 different scales. So if I see C major in a certain song, I can't just say that the key center is C major, because there's also a C major in F major, there's also a C major in G major, and there's also a C major in C major. So that doesn't really tell me what key center it is. The same thing goes along with the D minors or an E minor, right? Because there's 3 minors. So these minor chords appear in 3 different scales. So that doesn't give me any information, or not any specific information on what key that chord appears in, because it appears in too many of them, essentially. So the way to do this is just look at the fifth. The fifth, because there's only one of them, there's only one dominant, and fives are used much more commonly in music than the seven would be. So you look for a fifth, and that would give you a key center. So again, what you want to pay attention to when looking at chord scales is the 5 and knowing the 6, the relative minor. That will give you a good basis for understanding chord scales. Now, what I'm going to do is go over to the piano and then bring out my guitar, and I'll show you how to harmonize the scale. Now remember, a good thing to repeat to yourself is, what is a chord scale? Major, minor, minor, major, major, minor, diminished. All right, let's go see how it sounds. All right, so I'm here at the piano, and we'll just go over the harmonization of a chord scale. So if we look at the piano, obviously the piano is in the key of C major. All the white keys is the key of C major. So if I go from middle C, turn that up a little bit. That is a C major scale. Now if I want to harmonize it, I just make what's sometimes called block chords, or you can say triads. So I add the 3 and the 5 to each note. And that will give me the triad of that note. So if I just do that continuously up the scale, I get a chord scale. Now you can start to hear the difference. That again, this is just by virtue of harmonizing the chords with the scale itself, you get certain chord qualities. You get a major, a C major, D minor, you can hear that, E minor, F major, G major, A minor, B diminished, and back to C. That's the sound of a harmonized chord scale. Now I'll pull out the guitar and do the same on there. So here I am with the guitar. Now we'll go over a C major chord scale. So here we're going to do one string scale on the A string. So we're going to start with C. Right, so we're just going to run that up on one string. Now I'll harmonize it, meaning in this occasion I'll play bar chords just to harmonize the scale. So right, so that's the C major scale harmonized on the guitar. Again, so we have a C major, D minor, E minor, F major, G major, A minor, B diminished, and back to C. So using chord scales is also something that can be fun and creative. It's not only a great way to figure out what the tonal center of a song is, or a modulation, but it can also be used to create different progressions and creative ideas. So as I play the chord scale, you can already see that it sounds pretty musical. But we can also rearrange these chords and then put different rhythms on it to make it sound more interesting. Right? I just went up the whole thing in that instance, but I'm shuffling around. I could also start on a different chord. So I could start on the D minor. possibilities are endless, of course. But knowing your chord scale gives you a good idea or a good basis for figuring out progressions and also creating progressions. So I hope that helps in understanding how chord scales are created. In the next video, I'll go over how we can use this knowledge to help us improvise over common chord progressions like the 1-4-5 blues progression. Take care.